Welcome to Thought to Action, presented by the London Center for Policy Research, where we delve deeply into important issues, examine ideas, discuss solutions, and put forth thoughts to action. I'm Lieutenant Colonel retired Tony Shaffer, the president of the London Center, and I hope you enjoy our videos and our content. Please join our Patreon community at patreon.com, Thought to Action. Patrons are able to preview our Thought to Action videos before anyone else. We offer exclusive content and our access to the exclusive Ask Us Anything session venue to ask questions and try to help us focus our effort on that. Also, please subscribe to our Thought to Action YouTube channel and feel free to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And of course, through our website, londoncenter.org. So we're here today to discuss some of the most recent and I don't know how to say it other than continued controversial issues, which we don't believe are controversial because they're actually factual, relating to election security, the outcome of the election, and those issues which we believe as the London Center need to be continued to be looked at and researched. I'm joined today by one of our board members, Bennett McPhatter, who is a technology CEO who has worked extensively with the London Center to focus our efforts on technology and understanding technology, as well as he's been one of the biggest and most effective content creators regarding our analysis of the past election. And in our pre-interview, we were talking about the fact that there's no hard math on this test that we're about to go through, that a lot of what we're going to be talking about has to do with common sense. So I'd like to welcome Bennett McPhatter. Bennett, welcome to our Thought to Action podcast. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Tony.
So just let's get right into it. Bennett wrote an article that's now on the London Center website. Will America be true or false? And so much of what Bennett has focused on and what we focus on is simply trying to establish an understanding of what's in front of us. And Bennett, do you want to start off by just kind of giving a little bit about your background to the audience who may not understand everything you've done, and then we'll go into the actual content of the article.
Sure. Briefly, I'm a Marine Corps veteran. Worked in the intelligence field. Was an intelligence NCO for VMFA 321, Hells Angels, F-18 Squadron. On the intel side, I was trained in Dam Neck at the Navy Marine Corps Intelligence Training Center. That was a long time ago. Since then, for the last little over 23 years or so, I have been working in technology. I have founded or co-founded two successful technology startups focusing on enterprise software, large scale data, fusion, distribution, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a little bit about my background.
Right. So this article you wrote, will America be true or false? It's a lot of work you've done. It highlights a lot of work you've done to essentially analyze the results of the 2020 election. And I fundamentally believe that because of the media, the people of the United States have been subjugated to falsehoods, deception, and other anomaly issues that have to do with the mainstream media being committed to the narrative that nothing to see here, this was the most secure election in our history. And I don't believe that for a minute. So do you want to just talk a little bit about what you had to say in this article that I think that every American should read?
There's a lot of opinion going around. There's a lot of analysis of statistical improbabilities, comparison with previous elections, tapes of people allegedly doing certain things, double counting votes, things like that. I'm not weighing in on that at all at this moment. Each of those things would have their own sort of cycle that would need to be eventually adjudicated. The facts would need to be looked at. What I wanted to do here, because I'm really saddened by the divisions in America right now. So what I really wanted to do is to try and cut through a lot of the fog and take out in any analysis things that are statistically improbable. Okay, because the flip side argument for that is if they're statistically improbable, that means that they are possible.
Right.
Okay, they're
That's
possible.
a key distinction.
Right, key distinction. So, what I wanted to do is to say, okay, look, let's look to see if there's anything that's actually impossible, right? Mm-hmm. So, the approach that I took is starting with the data that was actually reported to the American people. Okay, and that's commonly referred to as the Edison data.
Right.
And what I'm going to discount in this analysis, and I'm not saying that any of that stuff is valid or invalid. Okay, that's not the point of this analysis. The point of this analysis is to look factually at the data that was reported to the American people. Okay, now ostensibly that data is created after the information is aggregated by one or more companies, one or more people that are running the election, let's say in a given state. And then there's a twin feed that's created. One side goes to Secretary of State, and the other side goes to the New York Times as the paper of record that provides the data feed for all of the other media outlets. So people will watch their media outlet of choosing, and they will see progressively throughout the evening, throughout the coming days, as the election unfolds, what is being reported. So the idea was to look at that document independent of everything else. There's a concept called the Four Corners Doctrine in the law, and basically, and I'm not a lawyer, okay, but it's an easy doctrine to understand. It basically means if you're looking at a doctrine, if you're looking at a document, okay, typically this is applied to contract law, but if you're looking at a document, let's look first to see what the document itself says before we look at anything outside the document. So in this case, calling it a document, people call it a data feed. These are pieces of information, okay, what's commonly referred to as Edison data, represents a lot of data points of reporting, right? You report at, 8 p.m. at night, 8:05 p.m., 8:08 p.m., so forth. So they represent independent data points that are in the document.
With that said, then, as you've gone through and established your understanding of the data, to summarize, to basically put it right on the table, are there statistical evidence of events which are not improbable but impossible within the data?
Yes, I think there are, and I would just say not statistical evidence, but mathematical.
Very good. Okay.
So that's the distinction.
Right. So if the data points are impossible, how would you explain that to our audience then? How do you then take this as factual evidence? How do we then, what are we supposed to take away from this idea that there's impossible data anomalies? How should we interpret that?
Look, so what I was trying to do here is to, inspect this data almost as if, instead, let's take all the emotion out of it.
Okay? Let's.
We need to do that, right? So, and it's hard to do that when you're living in the moment. Let's pretend for a minute that we're 50 years into the future and we're in some class and we're looking at this data in historical context, okay? What happens is this information, and by the way, this is the first election, I believe this is correct. I read this in multiple places, but this is the first election where we have had chronologically stamped, essentially, data from all 50 states throughout the election process as the data is actually being collected, okay? So one of the things that we really need to do is to take a look at the data itself and
Right.
first to see what we're working with. And I explained this in the article, but let me go through that a little bit. First of all, the term JSON data has been, passed around a bunch. JSON is just simply a data format. It's plain text. It can be read with the human eye. It's not something that has to be interpreted by a machine. You can actually type it on your keyboard, okay? It's not too different from a CSV file that most people are familiar with that they would import into Excel and things like that. JSON is nice in that it preserves some additional information that the CSV doesn't preserve, like the data types, being things like this is a date or time, this is a number, this is a string, and so forth. Okay, so in a non-technical way, there are a couple of pieces of information in that JSON document that we'd be interested in. The first is just an ordinal, okay? And by the way, it's worth noting that there's a separate document or data feed. I call it a document, as the contents of the data feed are in the document. But there's a separate document for each state. So there's one for, go through it, alphabetical order, Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, et cetera. So separate document, okay? That are all hosted on the New York Times servers. Now, and I say that because there's not a data column for state. That's right. So in the data columns for each state, there's an ordinal. It starts at 0, telling you that, hey, this is the beginning of what is going to be the reporting of the data, okay? And then it just goes sequentially, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like that. The second column is a timestamp, okay? And the timestamp column should align, if you order it chronologically, it should align with the ordinal, right? Like you can't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, have a valid timestamp as you're moving forward in time and have time go backward, right? You don't want that. There's something out of whack if that happens. So that should line up with the ordinal. And then you have 2 other data columns that are reported in decimal format, okay, that represent the vote share, right? And then you have a data column that is a number, just a regular number that represents the total number of votes, right? So it's important to understand that's the construct that we're working with. That's what's called the schema, okay, of the data. And then within that same schema, you then have the data itself that's being inserted. So you would have data, one point after the other. And we saw how the data was reported, sometimes minutes apart, sometimes hours apart, right. But you would have the data that's being inserted. In the document, when you have, some result that's being reported, let's say at 8 p.m. on election night, that result by itself should stand independent, right, of all of the other results. It should stand independent of that as a snapshot at that point in time, right? And as, fact, it should be, a factual representation. So right. That's the structure of the data that we're looking at.
You go through the article, and I would encourage people to come to londoncenter.org and read it and discuss, join in our discussion and go through this. One of the things I think we can agree upon based on your article and based on everything else, this all needs to be investigated, that these anomalies, these digital errors, these impossible spikes are something that legitimately needs to be looked at for purposes of accountability. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. Let me explain a few things that weren't in the article
sure.
itself. And at the end of the article, we say, we're happy upon request to provide, the code that was behind this analysis and things like that. And of course, we are. In that data schema that I just explained, where you have the percentage of a vote share for each candidate, that percentage is only given to the precision of 1/10 of 1%. So if you were to take a decimal number like 38.387, it's represented in the data 0.387. You just move that decimal point 2 places to the right, and that's your percentage, 38.7%. Now, if you look at the precision of 0.1%, okay, without anything else after, that, that's to the right of that, that's only accurate to 1 in 1,000, okay, to 1 in 1,000. So that means it's accurate to within 1,000 votes for every million votes and so forth. So, that wouldn't really be considered, precise enough to measure the votes accurately in an election where you have millions and millions of votes, right? Because it leaves a lot on the table there. And that precision, and this is very, very important, is for each data point. Okay, so if it was off by potentially 1 in 1,000 votes, you have 100,000 votes, maybe that's 100 votes off, but that's for each reporting period. So if it's reported at 8 p.m. and 8:05 p.m. and 8:15 p.m. and so forth, for each reporting period, it could be off by that amount.
Right.
I'm not saying it was,
Right.
it could. Okay, so when we looked for the impossible data, what we did was we eliminated that, what I would call a gray area that was introduced because of the lack of precision in that number. Now, why they didn't report it as just a numeric value, which would have been easier and the most precise of all and all of that, I'm not going to get into that.
No.
What I'll say is that let's give the most benefit of the doubt, because after all, our standard is a very high standard that we're applying here. Impossible.
Right.
Okay? Now, so what we did was we just multiplied the total number of votes by 0.001. Okay, and that's how anybody can do it for themselves. If you're an Excel wizard or anybody else, it's a very simple thing. You multiply it, and you get the total number of votes that could be off. I'm not going to say switched or anything. That could be off, right, one way or another in that election. So let me walk through a specific. Very simple example of what I'm talking about here that is illustrated in the article, okay? And to keep the emotion out of it, I'm going to change the name, so I'll just say Mary and Bob, okay? So we have an election, let's say, with the same structure that I just laid out, where we have 800 votes total. Let's say we're 10 minutes into the election. It doesn't matter, 10 minutes in, okay? We have 800 total votes. And Mary and Bob are tied. As of for the first reporting, Mary and Bob are tied, 50-50. So they each have 400 votes. They have 50% of the 800 total votes, okay? Now, 5 minutes later, there's another reporting. And the other reporting says there are now 1,000 votes total. Not 1,000 additional, but 1,000 votes total, right? So we do that math and we say, okay, 200 votes were added. We went from 800 to 200 to 1,000. That's 200 more votes. Fine. Now we have the vote share that's reported is Bob is at 70% and Mary is at 30%. All right, now full stop. If we look at each of these points of reporting at each point in time, okay, as an ostensibly accurate snapshot of the facts at that point in time, right? They should not contradict one another, right? They shouldn't contradict one another, right? So going back to my example, and that's our litmus test, right?
Right.
Remember, we had a rule in the document, right? What is false cannot be true.
Right.
So now what is false? Let's take the argument out of it. What is objectively false? And for our objectivity, we're using mathematics. Okay, so a simple math, what is objectively false cannot be true. That's a rule I think hopefully 100% of Americans can agree with. Okay.
Let's hope.
Now, let's go back to our example. If Mary and Bob were at 50-50, 400 votes each, and now there was 200 votes added, even if you were to give 100% of those 200 votes to Bob, Bob would go from 400 votes to 600 votes. And if you look at the percentage that 600 votes is of our now 1,000 votes, what is that? That's 60%, not 70%.
Right.
So, well, wait a minute. Then you have to ask yourself, in looking at these 2 points in time, and these two what I call claims, right? So in your document, you say, at this point in time, here it is, I certify this to be true. At the next point in time, I certify this to be true. When you have something that is a mathematical impossibility, like what I just laid out, you have to ask yourself, well, what's going on here?
Exactly.
Can they both be true? And the answer is no.
Yeah.
They can't, because they're contradictory to one another. So now you have to ask yourself, well, which one is false? Let's apply our rule. What is false cannot be true. Well, the answer is, if you're using this 4 corners rule to look, inside of the document itself and not bring in any outside evidence, you don't know.
Right.
You have no idea which one's true. Could it have been less than 800 votes? Could it have been, more than 200 that was added? Maybe it's 300. It was misreported. The fact of the matter is, you don't know without looking outside of that document. But what you do know is that they both cannot be true, which logically means either one or both are false.
Right.
So we use that as the standard that should be non-controversial. And sadly, we saw a pretty sizable number of issues like that.
So I think that's the bottom line here, and we'll have to wrap this up. But the bottom line is that, simply put, the publicly available information, if you examine it in any great detail, will demonstrate to anybody who uses common sense and logic and seeks the truth, there's going to be things which cannot be explained away, that simply should not exist based on organic counting procedures, had they been done fairly and above board. Is that an accurate kind of summary statement?
Yeah, I think so. And look, I've been very careful here not to use the word fraud or
Right.
lies or anything, because that implies intent, right? I wanted to really do this scientifically. Let's look at this document. And that's why I called it false. Something that is false. False is not an inflammatory term. It doesn't imply any motive. It doesn't require any outside evidence. Here it is. You look at it objectively. You do the math, true or false, right? So when you look at that, here's what I would say to that, Tony. I would say, if we see that there are falsehoods in this document, and our task before us is to certify the contents of this document, look up the definition of certify, right? Certify to be what? Certify for what? We're certifying it to be accurate and true to the best of our knowledge, right? So now we look at this. Can we certify in good conscience data as reported to the American people and as relied upon by the Secretary of State in each state that we now know contains falsehoods in the data? Can that be certified?
Right.
It could have been, a simple error. It could have been. I don't even want to speculate on what it could have been, because now we go down that rabbit hole.
Right.
But just really, in a completely nonpartisan way, looking at this scientifically, either, the math of, myself and 3 other engineers that looked at the work and things is inaccurate. And if it is, great, somebody pointed out, or there's objectively false information in that document. And if there is, I think that really brings up, other more foundational issues that we have to grapple with, like, what are we going to do about it, and are we going to continue to rely on this document?
And let me make this very clear to the audience. This wasn't simply in the swing states. These anomalies were present in the data for pretty much the entire spectrum of the election. Is that correct?
That is correct. I'm going to look over here to my my other document over here, where I have a dashboard. I have Arizona and Nevada that don't have any of these anomalies, and they were swing states. And I have many other non-swing states that had these errors. Now, remember, that doesn't mean that there were no issues in those states. But what it means is there weren't issues that were completely over that bright line of crossing from the improbable to the impossible. That's the difference.
And I think that's the key, and that's the thing we'd like to leave the audience with here, is that simply put, all we're asking for anyone who watches this is for a clear and effective review of the data, of how the data was produced, how it got to the public domain. And as Bennett has said several times, the analysis is true or false. That's it. It's not, it has nothing else to do other than what is observable, what is there in fact. And so I think that's where we need to leave this for now. But Bennett, I think we'll come back and talk about this more as we continue our research and study of this issue. So Bennett McPhatter, one of the London Center board members, thank you again for joining us today. And we look forward for you to hear back from you as you continue to develop your understanding and we continue our research in this area.
Okay. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. So, and that's it for today. Thank you for watching, listening to Thought to Action. If you like this program and would like to help us expand content and continue our effort, please join the Patreon community at Patreon Thought to Action, where you can preview our work early before the public gets access to it. And we look forward to doing more of our Ask Us Anything Q&A sessions, which are also going to be available via the Thought to Action platform. Please subscribe, hit the like button, please comment on what we do. Please consider joining the London Center at londoncenter.org. Join us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And thank you again for joining us today for our discussion on will America be true or false? And so much is left to do in research and to determine regarding the data that was used derived from this last election, and we'll continue to work it as one of our primary accountability issues within the London Center for Policy Research. Again, thank you for joining us today and look forward to seeing you again soon.